Hello, welcome to Convergent Dialogues. This is Xavier Bonilla. On this episode, I am very excited to bring the conversation I had with Peter Frankopan. Peter is a professor of global history at Oxford University and director of the Oxford Center for Byzantine Research. He's also a senior research fellow at Worcester College, Oxford. He is also a professor of Silk Road Studies and Bi-Fellow at King's College, Cambridge. Peter's work is on the history and politics of much of the planet, so the Mediterranean, the Middle East, Central Asia, and beyond. He focuses on histories of climate, natural resources, and on connections. He is the author of The Silk Roads, which has won numerous awards. It's well acclaimed. It's a fantastic book. He's also the author of The New Silk Roads. And his latest book, The Earth Transformed, An Untold History, is a topic of today's episode. We start the discussion by talking about how climate has been different on the Earth over billions of years. We talk about various climate shifts from billions of years ago that still impact the Earth today, and in some examples there. We talk about the evolution of hominids in the Holocene period, the formation of early cities, trading and impact on the Earth, domestication of horses in the steppe and how consequential that was. We talk about the industrial age and the beginning of fossil fuels. We talk about Rachel Carson and the rise of environmentalists. And of course, climate change today. I was absolutely thrilled to have Peter on the podcast. I mean, I enjoyed Silk Roads. And as I say in this conversation, I absolutely inhaled his new book, The Earth Transformed. I thought it was fabulous. It's obviously, as his other books, so large in scope. He's covering so many things. But, the writing is top notch of the highest level, and really is able to get at the central aspects of many of these important topics, namely kind of this sort of history of our natural history of the Earth, but really of what it means to have a climate that's changing, and really what makes the climate changing so fast in such a short amount of time today. And so it's a really, really helpful, document. It's a helpful book to show a type of, history of different climate shifts and changes to then kind of inform us how, at the very least, we have to continue to adapt and how we can make better improvements for our world today and for the future. As always, you can find this conversation at my free Substack, convergentdialogues.substack.com. You can also follow me on YouTube, Convergent Dialogues. So get over there, subscribe. Feel free to share and tell your friends as well if you are enjoying the podcast. Much appreciated. And now I bring you Peter Frankopan. I'm here with Peter Frankopan. Peter, thanks so much for coming on the podcast. It's a big honor.
Absolute pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, of course. So I will have done an introduction for you and everything in the beginning, but just on your side, just tell folks your kind of thumbnail of who you are, what your background's in, and what you're currently up to.
So I'm Professor of Global History at the University of Oxford, and I work. Well, I used to define myself by the regions that I work on. I specialize in what's now Turkey, Ukraine, Russia, Central Asia, Iran, India, Pakistan, China, and connections along the Silk Roads. But I guess I'm interested in making all sorts of different kinds of connections. So I work also on the natural environment, climate changes of the past. And I'm a bit like David Hasselhoff in Knight Rider. I'm kind of looking for problems to solve. Mm-hmm. And we historians, we don't normally think like that. We historians normally, you find a topic, the American Revolution, and you stick with it for the whole of your career. But I try to kind of keep learning things and looking at different kinds of connections. So that's the story about my new book.
Yeah, no, that's wonderful. So folks that may know you will know the Silk Roads, but you got a new one out, which is called The Earth Transformed, An Untold History. And is it fair to say that this is a book on the I guess you could say the history of various changes of the Earth's climate over since the beginning. Is that a fair kind of snapshot of it?
I guess so. I guess it's the history of the natural world.
Mm,
We tend to, when we think about history, and you study at high school and college, or just for pleasure, history normally means what humans have done, and it tends to be the same kind of roster that everybody listening will be familiar with. The heroes and the villains of the Second World War, the great moments of the past, that the French Revolution, American independence, etc., etc. But we get very shady, we get very obscure quite quickly. You start thinking about before the year 15 or 1600s. People eventually pick up on the Romans and Russell Crowe and Gladiator.
hmm
But a lot happened on this planet before we got here.
hmm
And a lot of our interactions, a lot of the most interesting history is about either that natural world around us or how we change it to suit us, for good and for bad. But some of the things which are the big questions of the 21st century, things like where are the big oil and gas reserves, where are the rare earths, where are the minerals, where's the best place to grow wheat or rice. Those are all things that we've got no contribution to as humans. Those are deposits, or those are regions that we've worked out how to cultivate that suit the natural circumstances, natural contexts. So I guess this book is trying to look at what is that natural world around us, how do we fit into it from the beginning of time, recorded history as well, and then what does that meant looking back at some of those familiar moments, as well as, of course, in the present and future.
Yeah. Well, I mean, as I was telling you before we got on, I absolutely love this book. I mean, your previous books are great, but this one really just kind of sunk into me, and I couldn't put it down. I probably read it in a weekend, if I'm honest. I just kind of just plowed through it. I really, really enjoyed it. So it's comes highly recommended from me for what it's worth, and so I definitely hope people get out there and pick it up. So it's very good.
That's such a generous thing to say. As a reader as well as a writer, those books that you feel that they're kind of urgent, you can't put down, and you tear through.
hmm
I love that, and also there's a little feeling of sadness as you get towards the end of a really good book, because you think this is so good. I kind of wish it could carry on. So if it did that for you, Xavier, then I'll be buying you drinks forever.
Well, of course, yeah. So let's. I was surprised. I didn't know how. I didn't really know anything too much about the book. I was surprised at where you started. So you start all the way at the beginning of the formation of Earth. You go back 4.5 billion years ago, and just do this big kind of overview of many of the various epochs of the Earth. And so it's interesting, kind of like you were saying, many people don't look at the history of climate or natural history. I've had a few folks on here that we have talked about some of that from a geology perspective or a biology perspective, but not from a historical one, which was really, really cool. How did the Earth, I guess, for you, in terms of climate and just in general, what's your perspective of how the Earth looked different and how it changed from 4.5 billion years to 7 million years BC?
Well, I guess the first thing was that I was thinking about humans' interactions with the natural environment. That was what I was trying to write about. And then I thought, the light bulb moment that many other scholars have had before me, which is, we are one species amongst very, very many on this planet. And, why would we think history starts just with ourselves? Maybe we should be more inclusive. So that was one kind of driver. The second one was that, I knew a bit about mass extinctions in the past and the end of the dinosaurs and volcanic eruptions that lasted for tens of thousands of years and changed climate. And I guess it was sort of thinking that, or realizing that every living organism on this planet, plants, animals, bacteria, all descend from things that survived those 5 previous mass extinctions. And that made me feel pretty small. I mean, that made me think that the stuff I worry about on a daily basis doesn't really count for too much, and that we as humans have only existed and written history, starting with written scripts about 5,000 years ago. We've only been around for about 0.00001% of the Earth's history. Even if I'll mention, I'm sure we'll talk a little bit about religions and things like that too. And if you have a very strong faith that takes the Bible or the Quran or Torah very, very literally about the creation, I'll say why that also fits. But I think it was the idea that you can't just talk about the environment and climate within the human context, because when you go back into the deep past, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, millions hundreds of millions of years ago, first thing you realize is that, like Goldilocks zones, our species wouldn't have been able to survive for almost all of the world's history.
Yeah.
And it just so happens that we're in a phase where this suits us extremely well. And again, you'll have listeners who've got, I'm sure, strong opinions about what's happening at the moment and how and why and what might come next. But I guess it stands to reason that if you change your natural environment around you, or the natural environment changes, then biology counts against you. You can't survive unless you adapt. And our species, we typically produce a new generation every 25 years. Parasites do it multiple times every day.
Right.
And that race to survive biologically as carbon levels change, there's less water, food supplies, etc., means that you've got to work this stuff out in advance, because otherwise we go the way of many other animals that don't exist on this earth anymore.
Yeah, I totally agree with what you're saying, and we tend to anthropomorphize everything, right, and see it from a human lens. But yes, you're absolutely right. For millions and billions of years, there was no humans on the planet, and we wouldn't have been able to survive. I when I was reading the book, I was trying to figure out how it would be kind of taking us through that journey, because obviously we're having this moment where we're really worried about the changing climate now, and humans substantial negative contribution to that. And obviously you do talk about that towards the end of the book more directly. But I guess the question here from history past, this very, 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 very long history, billions of years ago, is the Earth is always changing. The climate is changing. You talk about various extinctions, volcanic eruptions, the tectonic shifts, and all of these things still impact the Earth. So I guess, not to make a comparison, but people that maybe on one side of things would say, well, the climate's always changing. I mean, that's how the history of any planet would be, and I think you would agree with that. And we can talk about why it's different now, maybe towards later in the conversation. But how did those kinds of shifts, I thought that was interesting, impacts the Earth currently? As an example, where oil reserves are currently as shaped by past tectonic shifts, I never really put that together. And I was like, oh, that's why there's oil under Venezuela or in Arabia. Oh, okay, that's really interesting. So maybe just chat about how really ancient shifts in the climate on the planet still impact us today.
Well, the first thing is those shifts, they took in some cases millions of years. Those hydrocarbon basins that were formed because of the distribution of plants and tectonic plates and the way in which the geologies and climate and environments have all meshed together. Those explain lots of the geopolitical worlds. I mean, for example, the Middle East is a hugely complicated political environment, largely because of the distribution of oils and the inequalities that come with large amounts of wealth. And that, in many ways, one of the main stories of the 20th century was the story of control of the Middle East by interventions from the US, Soviet Union, creation of the State of Israel, Saudi Arabian wealth, revolution in Iran, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And I guess the first point would be, in the 19th century, nobody was that worried about it because oil didn't mean anything in those days, because we hadn't developed the kind of engines and technologies that made oil the primary commodity of the 20th century. And in today's 21st century, in the green transitions, there'll be a shift again too, not just because of burning fossil fuels, but the distribution of rare earths and things like lithium, also copper, and all the things that we need, the metals that we'll need to be clean and green. Those are all to do with distributions that are haphazard and long before we got here. So the geopolitical map of the world is dictated by that. In the United States, the southern part of the United States, very, very rich fields that unfortunately were so plentiful in terms of the chalk deposits, and so well done for climate conditions in the 17th, 18th, 19th centuries, that those became the heartlands of American slavery, or transatlantic slavery, I should say, coerced labor, human beings bought by the shipload and brought to the United States because the conditions suited the development of cash crops. And the people in the northern part of the American colonies were no more enlightened or better people, because it doesn't work that way. It's that the geologies, the geographies, the soils, and the productivity of lands further north weren't as rich as those deep, the deep American South. So all of these things have to do with events that happened millions of years ago. In the case of the chalk salts, hundreds of millions of years ago, and they took a really, really long time to take place. And I think for our human thinking, we think of the Wall Street crash as being just about within living memory. Somebody on the planet we knew, or somebody's grandparents were around about that time. Yeah. Thinking of Thomas Jefferson or American independence and wearing wigs, we think it's sort of almost comical. The idea of people living 2,000 years ago or 3,000 years ago, it's to imagine a completely different world, and yet it's a blink of an eye. So some of these big events that happened in the past, they took millions of years. So the question, I guess, Xavier, you're asking as well now is what's different about this time? And the difference is that the speed of change is what matters. And the climate has changed in the past. I guess if you want to take a negative view, when climate change, people normally lose. Yeah. So it's not enough to say, well, it used to rain a lot, now it doesn't rain a lot, people cope. Actually, people didn't cope. And so some of the great cities that aren't lived in anymore, no one knows where they are all the function of failure to adapt to all sorts of different things, not just climate and weather, not just the natural environment, but a whole set of circumstances where the aggravation is provided by lots of things, but weather and climate and natural resources always plays a role.
Yeah. There was a book that came out. It's called Other Lands, and it talks about, it's by I think it's Holocene. Yeah, fantastic book, because it talks about this very thing, about how the Earth, it's just, we've had 10 different Earths, if you will. It's just one period looks so different from the next period and we, as you said, we couldn't live humans couldn't live on the planet 4 billion years ago, 2 billion, even 60 billion. It's interesting when we think about that. So let's talk about I guess humans. Obviously there's an interesting evolution with hominids, shifting patterns in forest and conditions. I guess in terms of how in this period we can talk up to, I guess, the Holocene. How did the Holocene period become a more suitable climate for humans? Was it just the stable weather patterns, the amount of CO2? You can talk about Fertile Crescent, Green Sahara here, but what made, I guess, the planet generally sort of habitable for humans as we've evolved from hominids and then deeper into the Holocene?
Well, I think that there's a whole set of complex factors that interlink, and some are to do with natural cycles of the orbit of the Earth around the Sun, some to do with the behavior of the Sun and solar activity too. Our Earth isn't quite round, so we have a some eccentricity to our shape, so there are predictable cycles which we go through on 11-year, 22-year, and multi-generation. So we at the end of the Ice Age, the Earth began the start of a warming period. So. And that is not that long ago that the Sahara was green, or even that in Antarctica there were forests. All these things that we find quite hard to understand, but they were in not just blinks of an eye, like I keep saying, but they were not that far in the distant past. And what that did, those gave new opportunities and new challenges. And the first thing that you want if you're going to be able to colonize and span out is you need to have food sources. You need to have water. You need to have high levels of calorie consumption. And of course, typically that means availability of large protein sources, so animals that you can kill, or wild cereals that you can cultivate, or that you can pick and work out how to eat. So control of fire is important to be able to heat yourself, but also to be able to cook and break down a complex food sources so they're more digestible and give you more energy. And then as there become more and more people, those interactions start to change in terms of creations of hierarchies, in ways of cooperation, the way in which our species, Homo sapiens, came through and became the dominant hominin species, possibly at the expense directly of Neanderthals and others, because we outcompeted and were able to adapt quicker, smaller brains. So we have a shorter gestation period, easier to survive the traumas of childbirth. And so lots of these different factors all came together. But one of the things I think that was important was that those climate conditions started to become more favorable for wider distributions of populations. And that produced a series of pulses of dispersals that have been going on for the previous 50, 60, 70,000 years. Most of those had failed. so far as we can tell. Because what you need in the all kinds of, I was going to say the pre-industrial era, but in the deep past, is conditions that are highly predictable are much easier to cope with than ones that are changing dramatically. So the big rain events, droughts, volcanic eruptions can produce compressions that are very difficult to survive and to navigate. And the distribution of humans around the planet is a wonder in many ways about our ability to put setbacks behind and keep on going. Even by about 50,000 years ago, you're finding modern humans in as far away from Australia, probably new data suggesting that we need to think earlier about when humans first arrived in the Americas, crossing from Asia across the Bering Strait, possibly arriving in the Americas as much as 30,000 years ago. And that speaks to the ingenuity and also to the drive to go and find places that will accommodate better, finding climate niches that give you what you need. And as populations become bigger, there's a need to expand and find new places.
Yeah, I think the story of how humans evolved and how the planet was more suitable for them is really fascinating. And then, as you're saying, as it's Homo erectus that walked up out of Africa and started with one of the first humans to start coming out of Africa, and then how we just have populated the world is really, really interesting. So as we go through time, you start to talk about new commodities and materials start to come around 4000 BC, especially in the Fertile Crescent. And this you start having cities and you start having trading. So you can talk about that. It's interesting. I talked to Eckert Fromm, who does cerealogy. He's a big guy. He just put a book out on Assyria, and he talks about this as the kind of the first real big empire on the world, and all of that history. And so we talk a lot about the Fertile Crescent and stuff. And we talked a little bit about some of this stuff as well about commodities and formation of early cities and trading and things like that. So you can talk about that, but you also mentioned this watershed moment in 2200 BC in East Asia, which I thought was interesting. I didn't know a lot about that. You can chat about that as well if you want, towards centralization and the environment there.
Well, I guess sort of the idea of creation of cities or larger settlements, it's an evolving process. I think that sometimes in the past, some scholars have talked about the kind of there's a moment, or this is how things work, and some people settle down and they decide to live together. I think the functions of what's interesting is the first sort of big settlements all happen in ecologically prescribed zones, so that there are propitious water sources and good for crop cultivation and for rearing of animals. But on either side of those zones, there's space and uninhabitable space. So let's say the Nile. If you're near the Nile, then it's a great source of food and of minerals coming up every year in the Nile floods. But if you get into the Sahara Desert, then it's almost unsurvivable. Likewise, in Mesopotamia, the bit between the Tigris and Euphrates is fantastic. In India, the Indus Valley, or in China, the Yellow River and Yangtze. But these all happen because there's a golden region to live in, and on the other side of the golden region, it's not like silver medal; it's like no good at all. So as that golden region becomes more populated, then there are incentives to try to collaborate, and when there are incentives to collaborate, as in anybody who works in an office knows, or in a business, there are incentives to create inequalities and hierarchies of who makes decisions and who gets the greatest level of rewards. So some of these early cities start to form because of responses to natural environments. It looks slightly different in the Indus Valley. The course of the Indus moves a lot because of the silt that it carries, very heavy silt levels. And so there's a lot more space that can be used. And so that the drive towards inequality is much lower in the Indus Valley than it is in, let's say, Mesopotamia. But these cities, as they start to form, generate all sorts of different impulses, eventually including writing systems that are primarily around recording accurately who's growing what, who's doing what are prices, and to make sure that an infrastructure that makes the state work exists. And we slightly romanticize the idea of empires. We think that empires are all about expansion and power and territory, but all empires, in whichever region and period, are all about ecological expropriation. The reason you build is to take control of goods and resources. So the British is a case in point. The expansion of the colonies in the Americas and Spanish too, was not about, I would like more space on my map that shows I'm a powerful king. It's that what is there that either exists there that I can take, or I can grow there cheaper than I can grow back at home. And those impulses are the same even in deep history. And in Mesopotamia, some of the things that happen there are establishment of cities with great rivalries eventually, exhaustion of resources. So some of the cities chop down all the wood very quickly because wood is a very important, not just a heat source for keeping yourself warm and cooking source, but heat is required to make glass, required to make metal, required to make bricks in due course, except for when you can bake them in the sun. And so even 4,000 years ago, you're finding convoys going out looking for wood to be brought from long distance, overseas, in fact, into Mesopotamia. So you have these cities that rise up, they start to copy each other in their infrastructure, they start to borrow and compete in what they look like, how the kings behave. There's a kind of brotherhood of kings. This is what a state leader looks like. A bit like how we see the kind of G20 meetings, or, when our prime minister, whoever that is by the time this podcast goes out, because we keep changing them over here, there's a kind of an official way in which you get received, and then, you give back the other, you give back a suitably good gift. Here in Britain, we went crazy when Gordon Brown, who's prime minister about 15 years ago, came to see Barack Obama and gave Obama, I think, a part of a ship that had been involved in the US War of Independence as a way of saying how highly we value our relationship with our special friend. And I believe President Obama gave him a bunch of DVDs in return. And, we thought we had lots of arguments here about, was Obama living in the 21st century, and we were kind of crazy to be playing up these ancient pasts. But the ways in which these kingships in the ancient world stimulated each other, that they patterns of behavior, temples that start to establish themselves with hierarchies of priests who control ideas and control production, take taxes off people, and then build monumental buildings. All of those things provide a vibrancy. So around about 2200 BC, you have a series of empires. One, the Akkadian Empire, under Sargon and his descendants, Naram-Sin, his grandson. And around about 2200 BC, so about 4,200 years ago, we can detect in the climate signal across lots of different archives a sudden deterioration in weather conditions. We can see that from magnesium spikes in caves in Iran, from pollen in Oman, and so on. And what that did, in the simplest explanation, is it reduces revenues because you can't grow so much, there's less tax to go around, and your costs go up because there's inflation and goods go up in value. And quite often that leads to social unrest. And at this time, there's something called the curse of Akkad, which, the person who gets blamed is the boss and the king or the ruler. It's obviously he's living in an impious way, or he has angered the gods because he's too vain or too glorious or too Donald Trump-like. It's all about me, me, me. And by doing that, you've ignored the cosmologies. And it's not an unreasonable thing for people to have been questioning at that time. So why is it we're being punished with conditions that are not normal? Something has gone wrong. Maybe we didn't give enough offerings to the temple. Maybe it's Naram-Sin's problem. Maybe something else has gone wrong. But there's a kind of moment that some historians are trying to now define as the Megalean, a sort of break point in history, to look at a particular moment that the climate conditions change. Now, it's not completely it's not complete. It doesn't happen in all places all at the same time. So I'm slightly reluctant to think that this is a proper geological boundary point. But we see lots of compressions at the same time, because when you have interconnected networks, when one point fails, then the whole thing sags. And you see something like that happening in this period. And then there's a kind of a step towards recovery after that.
Yeah. I think it's super interesting how there's a continuous evolving and developing as we just keep building cities, and as we keep expanding. But what the treatment is with the climate and with the environment around us, real quick, just because I think it's important to note, is in the steppe, the domestication of horses. That was a huge thing, because we use horses now still. I mean, not like we used to, but but that was like the mode of travel and all these things. But like, you could talk about how important that was, and then the contribution that has to different cultures, and then what that also changes with the environment as well.
Well, horses were considered unreliable and dangerous in the first sort of city-states because horses were difficult to learn how to ride and to train. But the key, I think, is that obviously horses reduce distances dramatically because you can move quickly, and you can that means you're not just transmitting goods faster, you're transmitting technologies, ideas, diseases, everything else too. And as you know, Xavier, from the book I read about the Silk Roads, the conveyor belts of the steppes, these flat lands that sit across the Black Sea, the Caspian Sea, that run across the whole of Asia, more or less from Europe the whole way through to the Pacific coast of China, is a key vector of the transmission of all these things: foods, technologies, ideas. And we can measure that and date that with these new sciences and new technologies that we have, to see that these people who lived on the steppes, who bred horses and so on, have always been described by people living in cities as being uncouth, dirty, chaotic, and barbaric. And in fact, they're the glue that links cities together for three reasons. Number one, the speed, like I mentioned, of connectivity. Second, people who moan about the smells and the stink of horses and other animals don't like to do that stuff themselves. So they look down on the people because they think they can buy them at whatever price. But third, what makes cities tick above water is food sources. And you need people to have not just horses to travel, but protein. You need textiles that come from lamb's wool. You need dairy products as well. And the peoples living on the steppe are not a kind of part of another world. They absolutely rise and fall together with cities. The conjunction of the farmlands and the metropolitans is something that we've kind of cut the cord of that in the 20th and 21st centuries, where, these days, if you're the smart son or smart daughter, the best job you could get after college is to go and work for an investment bank or a hedge fund and get paid through the nose. If you say you want to become a farmer, people think you maybe flunked your grades, or there are lots of very smart farmers, but we put farming quite low down the hierarchy of who we think are smart. Astrophysics PhD, super smart; farmer, anybody could do that. Rather than an astrophysics PhD is potentially expendable, unless you're Elon Musk, and he must have a few of those up his sleeve. But we all need to eat. So I think that connection of what the land means, and horses were a hugely important part of that, because people in cities soon realized that the best way to capture other resources was with armies that could move faster, quicker, and fight better than anyone else's. So you need horses to be able to make your empire run. And places like China, places like India were not great territories to breed and raise horses. So the commodity trade was of finding nomadic peoples who you could buy your equivalents of Ferraris, Lamborghinis, battle tanks, and you need to be buying them all the time. And that means that the interactions with the steppe worlds and the peoples living on the steppes, and I mean steppes with two STEPPES rather than, it sounds like steps in a house, right? But that it's such an intensive and important relationship that it's not just about the role of the horse itself. It's about the peoples that rear them, breed them, the prices that get set for them, how many get sold at what time. And of course, the next point is you can only raise many horses as you have pasture land. So clearly, the more it rains, or the less it rains, or the conditions that have the most space and are close to cities, the difference for your reward structures. So it's a completely fascinating relationship between the two, and we just don't really think about it that much.
Yeah, I remember chatting with Marie Favreau, and she wrote The Horde. I'm assuming you've heard of it already. Oh, she's fabulous.
I've read it. In fact, I was on a prize committee where she did fantastic. The book did fantastic. It's a fantastic book. Marie is a genius. So
yes. I totally agree. She's the sweetest person. She's absolutely brilliant, and that book was, I mean, it opened up my mind in so many ways. Like I didn't know half of that stuff. And it's so well told, very rich. I mean, she's great. She's wonderful. And so I remember we talked at length about obviously the Horde.
I guess with that, just to knock that point on the head, what Marie has done, and what I try to do with Silk Roads too, is to remind that we think of the Mongols as being ultra-violent, chaotic. We've adopted all those stories that we heard from people living in cities, rather than, the Mongol Empire was was obviously hugely sophisticated, but it was also incredibly successful. But we've chosen to kind of edit that out to think, well, let's talk about ultra-violence rather than what made this empire tick, what made it grow so fast, and what were the Mongols really good at. And actually, as Marie would have told you, it's a really long list. It's a very surprising one because we've taken all those prejudices that we've done with lots of other ideas about racism. And again, in my world, when we had the Black Lives Matter movement in the US, which is such an important and powerful gateway to pass through, hundreds of years too late, but there we go. But those discussions haven't started in Asia, particularly around nomadic peoples, where the treatment in Russia, in lots of parts of Asia, about people who have different ethnicities and do things in a different way. There's still chronic racial prejudice that needs to get through the system, and we haven't even started with that yet.
Yeah, no, I absolutely agree. I mean, I think with the Horde and the Mongols, it's administratively how they were able to manage so much land and different peoples, and the integration was, I mean, absolutely tremendous. So I obviously want to be respectful of your time, so I'm gonna jump forward. There's many things in there. You talk about obviously the Roman Empire. You had some really good bits in there about the Mayan Empire, which was really fascinating. But I'll bring it up a little bit to more current times. Two or three big questions here. How big or how important was the industrial age, and how do we see? You talk a lot about the transatlantic slave trade. You talk about slavery here in the United States and elsewhere. But what was those big themes, and then obviously the industrial period, those big themes of how humans began to sort of change, or not change, but there was an evolution of what the interaction was with humans in the environment, where maybe there was less consideration or there was more of an exploitation of peoples and then of land. Maybe just chat about that thematically, I guess.
Yeah. Gosh, so sorry. Maybe I come back and do a second version, so we get rid of all those bits in the middle, which are really, I mean, I hope your readers will find it interesting. So now we think of industrialization as mainly in the form of the emergence of capitalism, but above all, at the beginning of the fossil fuel age, of the burning of carbon. The things that I think are really interesting about the industrial age is it's about the speed of exchange. What industrialization allows you to do is to intensify distance and speed of connections through all sorts of different ways. But one of the things that does is it globalizes very quickly. I mean, compared to the age of sail or compared to whatever. But something else that underpins industrialization, one of the reasons why it picked up so quickly in the United Kingdom, is that what mattered was not university educations and scientists trying to do breakthroughs one by one. It was lots of very, very small entrepreneurs making small adjustments to tools that allowed things to happen, to be able to scale up quickly. And we tend to think again about single moments, single individuals, almost always men, having a kind of light bulb moment. But industrialization allowed the speed by encouraging people to develop rewards from making products just a tiny bit better than they already were, and making the means of production a tiny bit better than they were. And that then sets in place a whole set of different sequences. First, of course, the rise of capitalism, the intensification of inequality, industrialization of having workforces moving into cities, so high levels of urbanization into squalid conditions. And the pace of that is kind of extraordinary. So Chicago has about 300 people living in it in about 1830, and about 50 years later, population of almost 1 million. Right. And laying out cities that quickly, building infrastructure to cope, having civic organizations that can put out fires, can have deliver justice for thieves or for disputes between neighbors. All those kinds of things require huge accelerations. And accelerations can produce very, very positive outcomes because people are trying to work out what the best thing to do is, and they're constantly learning. And I think that in some ways that industrialization was about lots of tests being done to see what would be the best possible solution. And in a funny way, you could look at it, it's not what I say in the book, but one could look at it to say that baked in such self-satisfaction by the start of the 20th century that we stopped innovating at that point in the developed West, where we doubled down on the fact that this is what our constitutions look like, that this is how you elect people in the United States, how you have your the colleges that submit their votes to Congress when you have presidential elections, and kind of baking in saying that's just how things are done, we won't change it. And one of the challenges we have in the 21st century is that in geopolitics, in climate, etc., when we're faced with change, we're not adapting particularly fast. We've given up on that tinkering that we do only in the private sector towards business and innovation, but not at government level. And probably we need a bit of a reboot about, what should the Houses of Congress look like? House of Representatives look like? How should they be elected? What role should we as citizens have, given we've got digital tools? We could all be voting every single day on topics that matter to us or don't matter to us. But we kind of shut the door and said, this is the highest form of representative democracy, and we're going to stick with it rather than ever change, because reform suddenly becomes difficult. But that's not what the story of the 19th century was in the United States, for example.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So last two questions here is you talk about the tremendous impact of Rachel Carson in the 60s, and she came out with Silent Spring. Actually, it was a recent book that just came out by Douglas Brinkley, where he talks about her impact and then the impact with some of the previous presidents in the mid 20th century. Fabulous book. It's actually bigger than your book, so it's a very large book. I
haven't read it yet, so I'll go and get a copy.
Yeah, it's great. And so I mean, just where did we get this awareness in the kind of the 50s and 60s of what we were doing as humans, the role of humans really on the things that we know about today, and then you can bring it up to today about the issues we have: deforestation, carbon, ocean acidification, etc. How do we start really getting this kind of momentum to think about climate change and global warming, and just kind of where we're at today and where we might be headed?
Well, I guess the traumas of the Second World War, for U.S. servicemen in the Pacific and in Europe, but above all the tragedy and disgrace of the Holocaust and the suffering of millions of women, men, children, and besides. I think that framed the anxieties for many people in the second half of the 20th century that we might one day repeat those prejudices and disasters. The anxieties around nuclear weapons that we might doom ourselves by taking stupid decisions. And then the way in which, like Rachel Carson in Silent Spring, over-intensive exploitation of agriculture, the heavy use of pesticides, the belief that science will always win out, and that anything that's new must be good, without ever thinking that you might kill off the bugs, but then you kill off all the birds as well. Mm-hmm. And that ingesting things that have been grown, having been sprayed with pesticides, was probably not going to be the smartest outcome. But then on the other hand, there was the second half of the 20th century was also one of profound hope and belief. 1955, head of one of the big US vacuum companies said within the next 10 years, there are going to be nuclear-powered vacuum cleaners. People thought that nuclear bombs, could be used to create giant new harbors on the American West Coast that would allow improvements in tourism, shipping, and new cities to be built. And looking back on that, you think, how can anybody ever think that nuclear detonation would be a good idea? But the achievements of the space program, what led to things like the internet being developed, were periods of real innovation and optimism about the future. I guess we're probably stuck somewhere in that same split Jekyll and Hyde world today, where we're deeply concerned about the present and the future in terms of global warming, sea level rises, extreme weather events. But then on top of that, AI, rise of China, fragmentation, of Russia, global trading systems and supply chains collapsing. You in the US are just passing a national debt at $32 trillion, something like that now. And that would make most people quite sanguine about what the future looks like. And yet at the same time, on a different day of the week, we might think, gosh, maybe we're not that far from attempted colonizations of the moon. These amazing things that are being developed in the sciences may make us stay ahead of diseases in the future. The ways in which we understand disease through decoding of the genome, and the ways in which we might look at reasonably finding cures for cancer in the coming years, and other diseases too, that we're quite innovative. And I guess our human story is about blending those two of faith in the future and also the fear of Armageddon. And every belief system, including the non-established religions, I mean, the environmental movement is very much in the kind of Judeo-Christian tradition of expecting at the end of the earth too. Mm-hmm. And so I think it's balancing those two between them. And Rachel Carson was at the pessimistic end of the the catastrophizing. So too was Paul Ehrlich and the population bomb, and the idea that we were going to die in our millions because we couldn't feed ourselves. We've managed to stay ahead of that bad traffic, but eventually you probably reckon on the odds of being run over at some point. So we've just got to stay nimble to make sure that we stay lucky, and that we don't have the kind of compression events and the shocks that have been so important in past human history that have led to places I write about in my book that most readers, unlike you, Xavier, won't know Uruk or Nineveh or Merv. They might know Angkor or Pagan, these great cities in Asia. But human history is all about things that have failed, that don't survive. Roman Empire, the ancient Greeks. That time keeps on moving, and if you don't adapt and embrace change, then you get replaced by different peoples, different political systems, and in the worst case, by different animals, by different species.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's just very nicely said. Well, the book is called "The Earth Transformed: An Untold History." It's out everywhere. Where's the best places for folks to find you and your work?
I have my own website, www.peterfrankopan.com, that I update periodically. I'm on Twitter. I try to engage. I enjoy Twitter. I lost my blue tick 24 hours ago, so which I take as a badge of pride. Actually, I don't understand that whole business model of people working for free, sharing ideas. But I love interacting with readers. I'm much happier to interact with generous and kind ones than ones who tell me that I've got a spelling mistake or something. But tell me gently. But it's a real pleasure for me to know that there are people who read my books. I'm a university professor, and most university professors want people to read their books, and it doesn't happen. So I'm really grateful that mine's on the other side of the Atlantic. You've read it, Xavier, and be so generous, and also to tell you read it quickly, which is the best endorsement an author could ever have. So thank you for that.
Yeah, no, it's a tremendously wonderful book. I was very, very happy to read it. It's one of my favorites this year. And very, very happy to have this discussion with you. It was absolutely wonderful, and you are, of course, welcome to come back on anytime. And
I'd love that. You know how to find me, so just reach out and I'll find I'll give shorter answers next time, I promise.
All righty. Well, thank you.
Thanks.